don't think so.
Okay, good. It was me for half a moment.
I mean, I've turned ours off, so.
Yeah. Oh, so, hey, it is 7 o'clock. So then I guess I'm just ready to go, right?
I think so.
Oh, okay. Well, and I guess I've been over here just talking away. So thank you, everybody, for joining us for tonight's webinar, Differentiation Toolkit, Simple Strategies that Work, which is part of NAGC's Spring 2013 series on planting and growing differentiation in the classroom. And it's a follow-up to last Wednesday's webinar, What Does an Effectively Differentiated Classroom Look Like? I'm Ginger Lumen. I'm a member of the Education Committee for NAGC, and I'm an education consultant who specializes in project-based learning, technology integration, and gifted and high-ability learners. I'm delighted to be with you this evening. Every WOW is recorded, and after the series has ended, it's accessible.
This meeting is now being recorded.
Oh, there we go. It's accessible in our Live Learning Center. To access the archives directly following this webinar, simply use the same link and password you used to access tonight's webinar. If you're having trouble listening to a presentation over the Internet and through your computer speakers, you can access the audio by phone. The number and the passcode are in the chat box, as well as your email confirmation. We highly encourage you to take this opportunity to ask questions via the chat box. You may submit questions to our presenters or to other attendees at any time, and we'll aim to address them during the presentation as well as a designated Q&A period at the end of the presentation. Be sure to click on the send button to send your message. The handout materials and the additional resources are located in the links box to the left of the slides. To access the materials, simply click on the link and a separate web browser will open. Be sure to view the differentiation book flyer to take advantage of the 25% discount. All right. Also, for those who like to tweet while listening, you can click on the Twitter link in the social media box. Facebook is also available. Another member of the Education Committee is tweeting tonight, so please join her. And now, I'm delighted to introduce our presenters. Julia Link Roberts is the Mahurian Professor of Gifted Studies and the Executive Director of the Center for Gifted Studies and the Carol Martin Gatton Academy of Mathematics and Science in Kentucky. Dr. Roberts directs summer and Saturday programs for children and young people who are gifted and talented and teaches graduate courses in gifted education. Tracy Floyd Inman is the Associate Director at the Center for Gifted Studies at Western Kentucky University. Tracy has presented on the state, national, and international levels, trained hundreds of teachers in differentiation and gifted education, published multiple articles, and serves as writer-editor for The Challenge, the award-winning news magazine for the Center for Gifted Studies. Julia and Tracy's new book on differentiation, Teacher's Survival Guide, Differentiating Instruction in the Elementary Classroom, is available at a discount to Spring 2013 WOW attendees. The flyer to use to purchase the book is in the links box. Julia and Tracy, the audience is all yours.
Welcome. We are happy to be with you. We welcome back those of you who were with us last week. And today we'll move along looking at the Differentiation Toolkit, Simple Strategies that Work.
We're glad that you're joining us this evening. And for those of you who were here last time, we want to start off with just a little bit of a refresher. And if you weren't with us last time, this will give you a context for what we're going to be talking about tonight. One of your first links that you have is the effective differentiation model. That's an instructional model to support continuous progress and lifelong learning. We have it here on the slide, but you actually have a link that could be a handout. This was what we used as a basis for discussion last time as we were looking at climate for an effectively differentiated classroom. If you remember, climate and culture, if you do not establish the right culture for differentiation, it's just not going to work. And that culture is conducive to many things, and you see bulleted lists here. Diversity needs to be embraced. It needs to be celebrated and acknowledged. And, of course, it needs to be utilized in learning experiences for children. Challenge, appropriately Challenging material for children are absolutely critical. You have to engage in high expectations that are also appropriately high. We want a culture that invites risk-taking for kids. And of course, assessment is instrumental to instruction, and that's pre-assessment, formative assessment, and summative assessment. And through pre-assessment and formative assessment, you're making decisions on how best to engage that child in learning experiences. If you don't have a strong organizational structure throughout your classroom, you're going to run into a lot of headaches. So those procedures and routines are very important to an effectively differentiated classroom. And of course, one of the keys to that is to practice them often and very early in the school year so that they become ingrained in the children. A community of learners is absolutely critical. It's very important that students recognize the diversity in the classroom and that different children have different learning profiles. And then a community of learners can be created in which they support each other. And of course, excellence in teaching is primary. You have to realize what your strengths are, acknowledge your weaknesses, try very hard to improve upon those so that you're the most effective teacher that you can be. And if you look back at that model, you'll see that the entire outward gray circle is climate and culture, which is so critically important.
And right in the center of the model, we have learner outcomes. That's what the whole schema of a classroom is all about in order for students to learn. And so the first question becomes the planning question: what do I want students to know, understand, and be able to do? And that arrow points down to the next question, pre-assessment: who already knows and understands the information and or can do it? Who needs additional support in order to know, understand, or demonstrate this skill? And who already knows it? So we're looking at both lots of types of learners. And then finally, what can I do for him, her, or them so they can make continuous progress and extend their learning? That, of course, is the differentiation question.
If you look back at the model, you'll see that there are pie-shaped wedges that extend from those learner outcomes. And this is where we look at the different instructional dimensions. So when we talk about differentiation, there are four main instructional dimensions wherein teachers differentiate. The first is content, and you can differentiate what you want the students to know. And there's certainly complexity and depth. Concepts go from simple to complex. Another area of differentiation is process. And please note that this is not what the students are doing to learn, but it's what the students are doing cognitively. And so you're looking at different levels of thinking, appropriately challenging levels of thinking. You can also differentiate product, and that's how students are demonstrating what they've learned. And assessment is the fourth one. How do you assess what has been learned? And in all honesty, that's a little more sophisticated one. Most of us feel more comfortable perhaps with some of the others. But tonight we're going to focus on specific strategies that look primarily at process as we look at thinking levels. It also ties in a few of the others, though, as well.
Of course, there are many definitions of differentiation. What we're going to focus on is the definition you have here. A teacher who differentiates effectively matches the content, the level of thinking process, the sophistication and choice of the product, and or the assessment to the student or clusters of students. And of course, the key phrase in that definition is it is the match. The match is the key.
So let's look at the first differentiation strategy we're going to use. And in our experience, we found that if you choose something that the teacher's familiar with, for example, Venn diagrams, and you show them how to tweak it so that they are differentiating their classroom, you're much more likely to actually use that. You guys are very familiar with Venn diagrams. I'm sure you did them as students in grad school, and you also probably used them with your students. But what we're going to do tonight is to show you how to use those in order to differentiate for your students. This actually stems from a wonderful little article by Lanny Konevsky. And she's the one who first wrote this up, and in fact, when Julia showed it to me, she's like, you know, this is such a great idea. It's so simple. I wish we'd thought of this a long time ago.
And so as we look at the Venn diagram as a differentiation strategy, the first question is, what is it? Well, it is a way to differentiate process for students. And remember, process is what the student is doing cognitively. Secondly, it allows us to have varied tiers of complexity. And you will see that in our case we're using ovals rather than circles because there's more writing space. But if you have 1, 2, 3, or 4 ovals, you have increased the complexity of the thinking process. And one of the tremendous advantages of this as a differentiation strategy is that it has equal participation of all students. Everyone's doing the same, and they have the same amount of time in which to do it. And many strategies you can't say that for because it will take different students different amounts of time to get to the end of it. But here you set the time, and all students are working at the same level for the same period of time.
I think that's one of the reasons why we wanted to start with this strategy is because it is a rather simple one to use, and it also can work very nicely in a classroom, one classroom period of 40 minutes or however long that happens to be. So let's show you what we're talking about. Let's say, for example, we have a third grade class, and they are studying Native Americans' reliance upon the environment for their survival. Now, pre-assessment, we spent a lot of time talking about that last week, and pre-assessment where you are determining what do the students already know, understand, or are able to do. So in this case, on a pre-assessment, we've determined that the child who's going to get 1 oval is on the very basic level with trying to understand the impact that the environment has on the Native Americans. So if their assignment was to write 12 ways that the Cherokee rely upon their environment for survival, that would be a challenging activity for him.
And it's not an unusual activity to give a whole class to look at one Native American group in order to do that.
Most of us have used the 2, and we're going to say ovals here because we've changed the shape a little bit so that it's more conducive to writing. And there are a lot of students in a heterogeneous classroom who would be very ready to compare and contrast 2 different tribes. I would venture to say that quite a few of you have even used 3. And those 3 bump up the level of sophistication. So you're looking at 3 different tribes and what they have in common and what they have that are different from each other.
And just think of the type of thinking you have to do in order to compare Seminole and Cherokee, Navajo to Cherokee, and then what they all have in common, as opposed to doing a description of discrete Native American groups.
Definitely. That leads us to the more sophisticated level. And for those gifted kids in your classroom, this is pretty challenging. And for some of you to look at it may be a little challenging. And in all honesty, when I do 4 circles or 4 oval bends, I tend to use colored pencils with it. And I might do the Navajo in yellow and the Cherokee in blue. And so I've got various shades of green in the middle. But if you look at this, as one little 3rd grader pointed out very quickly, he said that there's no way that you could tell what the Navajo and Inuit have in common. And if you look at it long enough, you're going to see that that's definitely the case.
And so we said, aha, and asked our friends in mathematics, and they confirmed the fact that, yes, that child was absolutely correct.
So this is a template that we have. And by the way, in your links, you have all 4 templates ready to go so that you can use those pretty easily. Now remember, this isn't rocket science. You're very familiar with Venn diagram. That's exactly the reason why we're doing it. I would venture to say that most of you haven't thought about using it for tiers of complexity as tiered assignments. Now, some of you might be looking at that and going cross-eyed. So if the ovals don't work for you, there are lots of other options. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but we do want to show you if you're just looking at one concept, Then you can use the letter I. If you're comparing and contrasting, you could do a Y. And that goes all the way to other letters. You could also use different boxes where you see A and B and what they have in common you're putting down at the bottom. There's one for 3 concepts and 4 concepts.
Or you can mix it up.
You sure can. And what we found, too, is that certain kids like certain shapes, or some are boxes and some like the Venn circle, so there are lots of different things you can do.
And the key is they're thinking at challenging levels.
Exactly. So let's look at an example. One way that you use it is your differentiating process. You have different kids thinking on different levels. This is an example from a middle school classroom where they are reading Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events. The assignment is a character analysis. The students were to choose a character or characters and to write 12 different descriptors. Now, in your classroom, you may very well, if they're going to say that Claude Baudelaire was loyal, you want to give an example of how he's loyal. But for some of the kids in the classroom, you're going to have this be a challenging activity for them to come up with 12 descriptors, 12 adjectives that describe a character.
And once again, it's not an unusual assignment to do a character sketch.
Not at all. More of your children are going to be ready to compare and contrast the protagonist Klaus with the antagonist Count Olaf.
Or any other 2 characters.
Exactly. The 3 circle, notice that we bring another character in, Violet. And notice that there are descriptors that are kind of scattered throughout, and they describe what the similarities and differences are. It's a much higher level thinking than just the 2 characters. And we can add a 3rd level to that, 4 characters. Now, notice that there are some empty blocks there. And those empty blocks, the goal, remember, for differentiation is not more work, it's different work. And if we had told the children who have 4 ovals to fill in every single circle, that's more work. Remember, the assignment was 12 descriptors. And each one of these examples we've shown you has 12 descriptors. So they're not necessarily expected to fill in all the blocks. How do you add another level of thinking? Well, notice this is a 3-circle Venn, and we have the antagonist, Count Olaf, the protagonist, Klaus, and then we have the student. And the student would be thinking about, what do I have in common with these 2 other characters? How am I different from those characters? Another variation is to use prediction. Count Olaf, as he is in the story itself, what might he have been like as a young child, and what might he be like in the elderly, as an older Count Olaf.
Another possibility is to provide a word bank. Now, you would do that if you thought it was important for the students to be able to look at the adjectives and then to think what fits where. That probably is a precursor to doing it on their own if that would seem to be a challenge for them.
Definitely, because we're all about challenging children and giving them the tools that they need to be able to be successful with that challenge. So let's look at a real kid example. This one deals with weather phenomenon. You see tornadoes, hurricanes, and waterspouts. And if you look at some of the descriptors in the middle, they all destroy things. They cost millions of dollars in damages. Temperatures are above 32 degrees to happen. Take just a moment and scan through that. You're going to see a lot of high-level thinking's gone on with this, and much more so than if the child were just doing waterspouts and tornadoes.
Far higher thinking than if you're doing purely a description of a hurricane, a tornado, or a waterspout.
Definitely. So not only do you use it to differentiate process or complexity of thinking, but you also have choice in how you use it, whether it's in class, individual assignments, or group assignments.
An example of this would be to look at types of rocks, igneous, sedimentary. Of course, what we're putting up as examples are just samples. You could be putting up any type of rock.
Sure.
And if you look at you could have different students doing igneous from those doing sedimentary, and then perhaps working together to figure out what they have in common, or you could have individual students doing it. But as always, the key is to pre-assess and know that whatever they're doing is appropriately challenging for them.
You may have two students who are doing individual ones, and then you're going to pair those students so that they are the ones who are doing one oval are now doing two.
Probably with the Venn more than with many other differentiated activities, I would be willing to let any student who wanted to bump up and do a higher level give it a try, because if it's frustrating, they'll back down.
I totally agree. And it could be if they reach that frustration level that pairing with another student might give them just what they need to be able to accomplish that together.
So here we've added a third and then a fourth for the in-class activity.
You can also use these for out-of-class activities, different homework assignments. For example, here's one with world religions. Now, you will notice that these do not have the same number of descriptors, comparing and contrasting. And part of that, to be quite honest with you, as we were developing this, it's actually a whole lot of fun, especially if you choose a topic that you have great interest in. And not only did we work on this here at the Center for Gifted Studies, but by the time we got to this one, we had included a couple of other departments trying to help us. Our goal was we really did want to fill in each one of these little spaces. So when you have children who are interested in your topic, and for gifted children, they have lots of different passions about different subject areas, you're going to see that they can take this and really run with it. And you're going to be amazed at the level of thinking that goes on.
So there you've got an activity that goes well beyond one class period.
Definitely. But you can use it however you want to use it. If we go back to the Lemony Snicket example, we start off by talking about character analysis. We discuss that in class. You do the pre-assessment. You see who gets what. And then at the end of that class period, remember, the beauty of Venn is that whether you did 3 circles or 1, you're coming together and everybody's talking about character analysis. In this particular case, with the take-home one, it's more of an individual type thing, and you may or may not have a discussion about it.
This even could be put up on a wall so that students could have a chance to go and add to it as they thought about it.
That's a good idea. So how do you use it? Well, the first thing you do is you ask yourself, what concepts do you want everyone to know when they walk out the door? And then you decide the focus. Are you going to be looking at characteristics? For example, the character analysis, you were looking at descriptors. Are you looking for examples? What are you looking for? And everyone will be held responsible for the same amount of descriptors or whatever that focus is. Trickiest part is deciding who gets what level and how they're going to be grouped. And of course, that's not based on whimsy. It's based on a pre-assessment, individual and written. And then, of course, you have to let the students know how they're going to be assessed on this. So rubrics would be passed out at the same time, and of course, you're looking for the number that you've asked for, but you're also looking for accuracy. And everyone will be included in the discussion.
So in the case of talking about rocks, no one is excluded. If you did metamorphic rocks, you're in the discussion just like someone who did 2, 3, or 4 ovals.
That's right. Now, Julia mentioned we talked to the folks in the mathematics department, and they mentioned to us that technically we were missing a couple of categories with that. This is an example of a Venn diagram. It's called the flower Venn, and it includes that which everything has in common, that's which none of them have in common, and we just wanted to share that with you. And this is what it looks like with that world religion piece. Okay, let's practice this. We are going to create a differentiated lesson using it. Now, we are going to start with 3 ovals, and that we have found is the best way to do it as an educator are making sure that you have 4 worthy areas. We are going to look at westward expansion, and we've chosen settler, explorer, and cattleman. And there are many others that we could have chosen. We could have put a railroad man. There are lots of different characters, but we've chosen these 3. So when you're going to use it, be sure that you're looking at concepts and that it has at least 4 different areas that you can discuss.
And people have different ways to start filling in or thinking about this. My favorite probably is to always look in the middle and say, what do all of these have in common? And, of course, the first thing that I think about is the settler, the cattleman, and the explorer were all risk takers. The other thing is, it seems to me like they're all seeking new opportunities. And of course, your classroom would be supplying these answers that you and I are going to talk about.
Of course. If I look at the settler, one way that he differs is that he or she, they're looking for new homes. That's their goal as they go out west.
And where men are always in all 3 of these, families are also with the settler.
I agree. So we can put families here, and I think we can primarily put men here because if you're going to look at a lone explorer or a lone cattleman, for the most part, they're men. Now, I want you to notice the discussion that Julia and I are having with this. That's part of the beauty of multi-tiers when it comes to Venn, is that you are discussing. And we could easily put men in a different place, and as long as you have a strong reason behind it, that's okay.
Seems to me like the cattleman and the explorer also have in common that they're on the move.
I would agree with that, because that settler, just the name settle, they're looking for a place to settle.
And they may move to another place, but they are establishing a home in each case.
Definitely.
If you look at a cattleman, he followed a route. He established a pattern and probably took the cattle back and forth.
Mm-hmm. So the settler, for the land, they're looking at a home to settle on, and the cattleman uses the land as a route to get from one place to the next. Of course, that differs from the explorer's goal and how he's using the land. He's trying to find new resources.
And both the settler and the explorer were moving into unknown territory.
Now, we could spend quite a bit of time with this, but I think this gives you a feel for what we are looking at. We're looking at higher levels of thinking. It's not just jotting down descriptors of different places, but notice as you look at these different things that we've written down, some are descriptors of the people, some focus on what their goals were. There are lots of different ways to think about this, and a multi-level Venn gets that happening.
Seems to me like this is a really good way to summarize after you've studied something, as well as to use as a ongoing activity. If I've been studying westward expansion, I ought to be really quick about coming up with some of these ways of looking at what the settler, the cattleman, and the explorer each did.
I've used this as an assessment in my class, part of the final assessment. So it can work out really well with that. But what we'd like for you to do now is just take a moment and think about, what do you teach? What's your role in the school? How can you use this? And it's just unlimited, the possibilities. You could use different quadrilaterals and what they have in common. You could do this with different chemical elements. Think about different presidents that you're comparing and contrasting. You could do it with economic systems, branches of government. I think it applies to just about any content area.
Any content area, you've just got to know the big ideas.
Exactly.
And to give students opportunities to think about them.
So remember, the beauty of this is you pre-assess, you are challenging the children based on different levels of complexity, how they're going to think about whatever your topic is. You can do it in a set amount of time. It should be challenging for each child if you've pre-assessed and matched correctly. And then it also brings everybody back together talking about the same concept. So it's very respectful.
And you have the templates. So it's not hard in order to plan a lesson that would use the Venn in order to differentiate, the biggest challenge of all is to have the rubrics ready so that you're ready to roll with it.
And I'd also like to point out, as far as rubrics go, you may fill this totally out and think you've got your key ready to go, and you know as well as I do that those children are going to be real creative, and they may put down descriptors. And if you're not sure what they mean, be sure and ask them, because you might be surprised at the level of thinking that goes on and the reasoning they have for putting a descriptor where they did. Charlene, I noticed that you put that it hits Bloom's higher level thinking, and that's a wonderful segue to our next strategy, because we are looking at Bloom's. But I agree with this, because I think the point is that we're trying to challenge kids to think about the concepts at higher levels.
You want them to ratchet up their thinking, and everything in the new Common Core is asking for that to happen, and this fits into it beautifully.
It does. Last time we talked about you can differentiate, interest and learning profile and all those different kinds of things. But when you're looking at gifted children, if you really want to try to meet needs, you need to differentiate on readiness or ability. And in this particular case, you're differentiating on different levels of thinking. And so that's going to be more challenging for the gifted child. Let's move on into Bloom. Bloom is our next one, and again, remember, we are not trying to show you something that's totally foreign that you will feel uncomfortable in practicing. You all know Bloom inside and out.
I would venture to say that all of you are familiar with the revision of Bloom, and the only two changes from the original are that the words, the nouns become verbs in the revision, and the upper two levels switch places, which always kind of makes sense to me. So create is at the top, remember is at the bottom. Nothing wrong with remember if that's where the student is. We need lots of information that we've remembered,
Definitely.
But we just don't want to stop there.
I also like the fact they're verbs, because thinking is definitely an action, an activity, and that is reflected.
It makes sense.
Now, I want you to realize that we think all children need to think at high levels. And there are many times that you use Bloom's taxonomy in your classroom where most of you start at the bottom level and you do activities that bring all the kids up to that create level. That is not how we are using Bloom's. We are using Bloom's for differentiation. And so we're going to base it on pre-assessment, and we're going to really try to make that match, so we're pushing kids to think at appropriately challenging levels. Here are 4 activities, 4 learning experiences. And we're not necessarily going to call on you or anything, but I want you to look at this and think about those 6 levels of Bloom. Which level is create a brochure explaining the president's duties and the duties of his or her cabinet?
And which level is it to design and construct a poster defining quadrilaterals? Include at least 5 examples.
Dressing as a character in the story, describe yourself and the role you play in the story to the class.
And finally, write and illustrate a children's book outlining the parts of speech. The book will be presented to a 3rd grade classroom.
Let's look at that first one, Julia. And when we see the verb create, it's almost like ding, ding, ding. We know that that's the highest level of Bloom's. But I want you to look at it. It is not the highest level of Bloom's. I don't care that the verbs create. Look at what the child's actually doing. The child is explaining the duties of the president and the cabinet. So what level of Bloom's is that actually, if you're simply explaining? Way near the bottom, isn't it? You're understanding. You're putting something into your own words.
You might even be remembering.
Yes, that's true.
If it was written out in your book.
Same thing with the second one. You're designing and constructing, and those verbs seem so high level, but when you look at it, what's really happening? You're defining what a quadrilateral is, and you're given 5 examples. Again, that's very low-level thinking.
And in the next one, although you're dressing as a character, you're describing yourself and your role in a story to the class. Doesn't go up very far in the revised Bloom.
And just because you're writing and illustrating a children's book, it doesn't mean you're on the create level. All you're doing is outlining the parts of speech. Now, we deliberately misled you, tried to mislead you in this because we chose the verbs that are very, that seem high level. We put lots of detail into them, so it makes you think that they're thinking at high levels. And basically, the point we're trying to get across is that we have a lot of well-meaning teachers who are designing engaging, perhaps physically engaging, activities, but they're not mentally engaging. They're low level. So what can we do with this? Let's just take that one, the dressing as a character, describing yourself and the role you play. How can we make that higher than those bottom levels of Bloom?
One of the ways would be dressing as a character in the story. Explain why you acted the way you did in a pivotal point in the story.
Look already, instead of just describing, I like this and I do that, you're explaining why. So we're looking at reasoning, and you've got analysis all of a sudden that comes into play. And you're also deciding what is a pivotal point. Excuse me, a lot higher level thinking is going on in that one.
Another possibility is also dressing as a character in the story. Imagine that you acted the opposite way that you did in a pivotal point in the story. Predict how this would have changed the outcome. Just think of the thinking that requires as opposed to the explaining what happened in the story.
So we've gone from the understand level that was our original prompt all the way to the create, because they are predicting and imagining. It's not that challenging to tweak it and make it high level. It's so critically important that you look at what real level of bloom is going on when you create a learning experience.
This next one is also dressing as a character in the story. Analyze the relationships you had with two other characters. Explain why your relationships were the way they were. And, of course, you could tweak that one and change a relationship, and lots of possibilities for what you could do that would really up the level of thinking as you've dressed as a character and are relating to a story.
So basically our main point here is be sure that you're examining each task through a Bloom's lens. Don't be fooled by that word choice. It's interesting, we've used similar activities to this with lots of different groups of teachers, and as a whole, they tend to think that they're higher level Bloom than they really are. So remember, we are trying to appropriately challenge children. And if you've got gifted kids who are thinking at high levels, we need to make sure that their learning tasks are at high levels.
I am sure that many of you who are with us right now work with other teachers, you do professional development,
right.
And a similar activity is a really good thing to do because, as you say, Tracy, many teachers think that they really are challenging at high levels, and until you break it down, you don't realize the fallacy in your thinking.
Especially when we've got great hands-on activities, and we mentioned this last time. It's not just hands-on, it's got to be minds-on, and minds-on is more important than the hands-on.
Minds-on trumps hands-on anytime.
So what is a Bloom chart? Well, basically, you have all children in the class studying the same topic, but they are going to be doing it on various levels of complexity, and that verb, how they're processing it, is going to be different, and they're going to be demonstrating what they've learned with different products. The key is the match, that the learning experiences will match what the students know and are able to do, and that is what encourages continued progress for the children.
Which is where we started with this session, that it is the match of the learning experience to the student and their level of readiness.
This is what a Bloom chart looks like, and you have this in one of your links. And we want to emphasize to you that this is the teacher's planning tool. The child does not get this chart. This is what you will use to come up with your different learning experiences. You also have as a link this fractions example.
Fractions, things that just come up year after year. No matter when they're introduced, there's some continuation. And the fact is that fraction stays your concept down the middle in the content, but what changes will be your verb under the process, what you want the student to do cognitively, and the product choices that you give on the right side. And then underneath each level, you will see that there is a way to string together your process, content, and product to really write it out as a learning experience. Explain fractions in a discussion or a role play, or if you move up to analyze, compare fractions and decimals with a Venn diagram or on a poster, or go to the top one. Create examples of an interesting, unusual way to use fractions. Remember, it's got to be something creative with the content.
Exactly.
Or to teach someone else about fractions and select the product that lets you do that best.
So we're all talking about fractions, but we're processing it on very different levels. For some students in your class, the pre-assessment says that if they can simply identify what a fraction is, that you'll be thrilled. You'll be happy that they're thinking at that level and that they can process that. But then you have other kids who are very much able to organize those on a number line, and that's a much higher level thinking. Some of our gifted children, they could do that in their sleep. So they perhaps will need to justify learning about fractions in a persuasive essay. So the key here is the match. We're all talking fractions. We're all thinking about fractions, but on very different levels.
And Tracy, I think this is a wonderful example of why you can't start at the bottom with the learning experience and take everyone in the class through each of them.
Definitely.
It's inappropriate.
Yes.
This is about differentiation. It's about matching the learning experience to the level of readiness of your students. And it certainly would bore the socks off a kid to have to identify fractions on a chart or with pictures if they really could perform any kind of an operation with fractions or decimals at a much higher level.
Well, and for some of our underachieving kids, they might not even bother doing that. If they already know how to do it, why should they waste their time?
And on the other hand, for the child that needs to learn about the basics of fractions, it's incredibly important that they have that opportunity to do so.
You bet. Take just a moment and look at those products. On only one of those do we actually have one choice. Choice is extremely important because bottom line is we don't care how these children show us what they've learned about fractions, whether it's a poster or a chart or a number line. What we care is that they are learning about fractions at that level. So notice how many times we give choices. Lots of different times. And then look at this one at the top. Lots of choices. We don't care what the product is.
And so many times the product is the way to motivate a student.
Yes.
Because they find that it's far more interesting to do a poster or something that uses art than it is to do something in another area.
We do want to caution you, though, that if you are giving these choices of product, you have to make sure that you are providing the guidance that the children need to create a quality product and that you're going to be assessing them appropriately. So make sure that you have a rubric that guides the child in developing the product and that guides you in the assessment of that. One of the links is a products book that Julia and I did that introduces something called a DAP tool. It's a protocol that helps with product development and assessment. And DAP stands for Developing and Assessing Product Tool. And that's just one resource perhaps that you could use that would make sure that you have those products being held to high standards.
It is very difficult to give students a choice of product unless you have a rubric or a protocol that you can use that will guide them.
Definitely. Let's look at another example. Here we have next generation science standards that are hot off the presses, aren't they? So this is one that looks at the properties of matter. The lesson hook has two different readings. Basic level learners will be looking at solids, liquids, and gases, and then higher level kids who are reading on higher levels will use another resource. So right there we already have some differentiation going on. But then there's even more because they're going to show us what they know about properties of matters in very different ways. For example, for some of our students, it would be very challenging for them to just explain what those states of matter, what they are, and to illustrate them in flashcards. But for most of our children, or for gifted children especially, children could readily classify what they are in a chart. And on the highest level, we have created a toy that uses at least 2 states of matter.
For someone who's ready to do that, wouldn't that be fun?
Now, do we hand the kid this sheet that says properties of matter? Well, no, first of all, this is your tool, this is what you use, but you would change the form for the child. And then you would not give them these 6 choices, because if you do, what are they going to choose?
The easy one.
Sure, most of us are going to choose those bottom ones unless it's a really cool product that we want to do. So this is where that pre-assessment comes into play. So I may take these top 3 and put those choices on a white sheet of paper, and I will take these 3 and put them on an off-white sheet of paper. And based on my pre-assessment, I go and pass those papers out, and I know who gets the white sheet and who gets the off-white sheet. So it's very easy for me to make sure I'm appropriately challenged them. As far as the child's concerned, he has 3 different choices.
And maybe could do 2 of the 3.
Exactly. Exactly. So realize that it's real important that you give limited choices.
And all need to be equally engaging. There need to be products that will let the students use the various strengths that they have, their talents.
Definitely. And remember, you're not really concerned with what the product is. If a child comes to you and says, oh, on this one, I really don't want to do a poster, can I put it on a PowerPoint instead? Sure. So how do you use it? Well, maybe you're doing an in-class activity. And this is one based on nutrition. So for some of our students, they may be defining the elements of nutrition with a poster or wrap, and then you've got other kids who are working at much higher levels where they're creating a nutritious recipe or a new ad to sell nutrition to children.
And Tracy, I like the one under that on evaluate, take a stance against or defend fast foods in an editorial or a debate. Sounds like you could really get kids thinking on that one.
Without a doubt. And I know that you do have these that you can print out from the PowerPoint. I do want to point out that Julia and I have another book that has, a whole chapter just on Bloom charts with lots and lots of different examples in it.
And another chapter on Venns.
Right. And those are just other tools or resources that you can use.
You could also use Bloom to create centers. In fact, it is a wonderful way to create centers.
Yes, it is.
It is very easy to take colored folders and put each task on the center of a folder. And, for example, you could have 3 red ones, 3 blue ones, or whatever color scheme you wish, and then have a menu of what the students are going to be doing, whether it is for center activity or if it's for any extension that you want to do when students have completed other work.
So, for example, in this, maybe it's a humanities class, and we're looking at different periods in art, and one center is Monet and Impressionism, and perhaps there's one on realism and classicism, whatever areas you want to do. But, for example, on the Monet and Impressionism, the higher level ones are all going to be in blue folders. So a child knows if he's been pre-assessed, you're going to say you can choose any of the blue ones that you want at any of the centers. So that works out very nicely. You can also use it as a unit assessment.
And here we have an example from Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. The create level I find to be really an excellent one here. Create the jury deliberation, exemplifying the roles of prejudice and discrimination, the key concepts down the middle. that resulted in their guilty verdict in a skit. And of course, if you read To Kill a Mockingbird, that jury deliberation doesn't happen, and so the create part is high-level thinking.
And what's the most important thing about this? Well, as the sophomore honor students are reading To Kill a Mockingbird, we want to make sure they've really processed the role that prejudice and discrimination play in the novel. So they could process that on various levels. So I would give limited choices to students that are appropriate to their pre-assessment indicators, and then they could be able to show me their understanding of that.
But even at the lower levels, they are engaging. The Oprah skit, for example, is with apply. And so you must remember that at all levels, it should be interesting. It should engage the students.
Respectful tasks, you bet. You pre-assess, and a child shows you that he already knows 80% of the material that you're getting ready to teach. What do you do with that child? A bloom chart is a wonderful optional learning experience. For example, you have an insect unit, and this child shows you that he already knows most of what you're getting ready to teach. You could give, and he does not know much about the social insect aspect. So you could give this sheet and let the child choose any two of these activities, or three, whatever your magic number is, and he would continue to learn about insects just as your class is continuing to learn, but he would be learning new concepts with continuous progress.
You're making the content a little more complex as you're moving on to a more specific type of insect.
And I also want you to notice how different this looks. Remember we talked about that bloom chart as your planning sheet. It can look very different for children. Here's one on social insects. Here's another one looking at China and the warriors of Xi'an. So, how do you use the strategy? Same question as before. What is it you want everyone to know, understand, or be able to do when they walk out the door?
And that's your concept.
It goes down the middle. This little phrase is just 2 words, but it's pretty challenging. You're going to create the tasks. The task must be respectful. They need to be at the level you think they are. So you don't just focus on the verb. You think about what learning is really going on. Then you figure out who's going to get which option.
And, of course, pre-assessment data are key here.
Definitely. And the child cannot create an authentic, high-quality product unless that rubric's in front of him, and that rubric needs to be high quality, and you would use that same rubric to assess. Now, I know we're getting a little close on time, but let's play just a little bit with creating a bloom chart. I think we mentioned that you have a template, and this is our bloom chart.
The most difficult learning experience on a bloom chart always seems to be create. And one of the challenges, almost a predictable challenge, is that people think a creative product makes the level create. And that's not true. It must be doing something with civil rights or whatever your content is, rather than writing a story about it does not make civil rights a high-level task.
Exactly. So as you are creating these, what we often tell teachers is to think about what's one of your favorite units you've always taught. And we're going to use civil rights right now, but if you choose a unit that you love, you've already done quite a few different activities to help children learn about that concept. So what we're going to do is we're going to choose civil rights, and you have with you, you have learning process verbs, that's one of the links, and you also have a list of products, that's one of the links. But what we're going to do is come up with some ideas right now.
So if you were to start at the bottom, how about enumerate the civil rights guaranteed by the Constitution? And what would make that interesting for folks product-wise? Perhaps a poster or a skit. Different kids really enjoy one of those or the other, perhaps.
Okay.
Then why don't you, to make this a little quicker, why don't we go up to apply?
Sure. So here we're going to use the information of civil rights. Here, let's see, we're going to create an illustration.
Or a PowerPoint. Give them a choice. Technology is probably always engaging to some of the students. And have them develop 2 scenarios that illustrate a civil right. And perhaps 2 is better than 1 in that it shows that you really are able to apply it in different situations.
Yes.
Then perhaps you'd want to skip up to the top. Create a civil right. And I actually remember working with a group of teachers who struggled on this one and finally decided that they needed to think of a civil right issue in the future. And they decided to write an essay as the final product. You have to understand civil rights to be able to project or predict into the future what one could be. And can you imagine the wonderful discussion that young people will have if they are ready for that challenge? And like everything else we've said, it is the match between the learning experience and the student's readiness.
And Irene, you mentioned a compare and contrast task, which is great for analyze. You could take 2 of the civil rights that are guaranteed by the Constitution and compare and contrast how they're used in contemporary society. You could take a civil liberty or a civil right, and how is that protected in America versus South Africa or another country. I think there are lots of different things that you can do with this.
And it's especially nice if you have other teachers who teach the same topic to do this kind of planning together, because it allows your ideas to flow so readily as you bounce them back and forth.
We've tried to give you a couple of tools, and there's nothing magical about these verbs. It's just ones that we feel like tend to capture the essence of that level of bloom. We've got lots of different products, and again, this is not the end-all or be-all, but it is certainly a good starting point for you. But remember, the goal is continuous progress for all students, and that's what differentiation is about. Where is that child when you're starting this learning experience, and where is he at the end of it? The effective differentiation model helps guide you to those outcomes.
And you know, Tracy, the part of the title is an instructional model to support continuous progress. Oh my goodness, that's important. And then to create lifelong learners.
Without a doubt. So we discussed last week how differentiation is more than just a set of strategies. But realize effective strategies are very integral to a differentiated classroom. And they can only be effective, though, because that culture supports differentiation. And that's what that model talks about. We do have some time left. Do we have questions from folks?
You did have a question that was just right there at the end, and it was, how about a compare-contrast task? And then there was another question that was a little further up, and I'm going to go ahead and drop in that question so we can see that too. So how about a compare-contrast task? What would we do?
Well, let's go back to the westward expansion concept. If we're going to compare and contrast that, well, we certainly have the different roles that the settlers play and that sort of thing, different communities. You could also look at westward expansion as it compares and contrasts to other periods of exploration.
I think anytime you're using the then in more than one oval, you are comparing and contrasting, and that becomes increasingly complex as you add the third oval and the fourth oval, but that is an excellent example of comparing and contrasting at multiple levels.
So it's very legitimate to do a bloom chart and have your product be a Venn diagram, and that's perfectly fine. And if it's a 2 Venn diagram, then that's going to be right in that middle level of thinking. And Irene, I see here you put the double bubble map. Sure, that works beautifully too. I know there was a question that looked at sites to visit. That's a tricky question. There is a source that I can recommend, though. Oakwood City Schools. It's a district in Dayton, Ohio, and they have had a 10-year initiative for differentiation. In fact, Julie and I are going to go there next month to visit. Dan Weckstein, and let me grab that resource.
But there are so many places wherever you are living, I'm sure, where someone is doing wonderful differentiation. The sticky part for us when people ask that question, it's hard to go to a school where everyone is differentiating, and so perhaps the school system you're talking about, Tracy, where we're going to visit, is an excellent example because it's long-term.
Exactly.
That they've been working to thread differentiation and infuse it throughout the school.
Yes.
I went ahead, and if I apologize if I overstepped boundaries there, but I am dropping a couple of links in for different websites that might have some resources in there. One is Dare to Differentiate.wikispaces.com, and another is a live binder of collections that I actually have put together. If anybody's interested in copying and pasting there, I don't mean to overstep. We did have one more question.
Wonderful. This is all about sharing resources.
Use that.
Thank you. Yes, websites. I'm all over that. So, there was one question early, and I know we just have maybe 2 more minutes before we need to actually wrap it up. We want to respect folks' time who are limited time. The question was, I'm glad the speakers mentioned good active work that may not be mentally challenging. That's where you were talking about the create. Is it really at the highest level when we use that verb? How do we know when to offer support versus bringing them through the whole lesson? Small groups? Attention span?
I think everything depends on pre-assessment. What do you know about the child? And ongoing assessment continues to feed information that helps you make appropriate choices, but it is the match. And it cannot be done by what you think a child knows. It's got to be really on paper, to have the students respond. What do they know about blank? Could be an open-ended question, but some way you've got to know what experiences and knowledge the child has to bring to the task.
I think that's so true, and that formative assessment, those checks that are going on throughout the learning experience can also help guide you. Okay, this child needs a lot more support. He's getting very frustrated, or perhaps this child's whizzing right through this. We need to make it more challenging.
Excellent. I've got to tell you, I've been talking differentiated instruction for a few years, and this was a really informative and some new stuff for me, and it sounds like in the chat that was new for them too. So thank you very much for sharing this. And I'd like the audience to go ahead and please join me in thanking Julie and Tracy for once again sharing their expertise with us. And let
us thank you for being a part of this. What we're talking about is pretty basic, but we think that if you're going to differentiate effectively, you've got to start at pretty basic level.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Good luck differentiating. It is so important.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we hope that you will be able to, well, not just Julia and Tracy, well, you're invited as well, but everybody in the audience will join us Wednesday, May 8th at 7 p.m. Eastern, when Richard Cash will continue the conversation with engaging learners through a thinking classroom essential to the Common Core. Please take a moment to fill out the online evaluation located in the links box, and please give us your feedback so we can continue to wow you with these online sessions. On behalf of NAGC, thank you for everything you do to support gifted and talented learners. Have a good evening, everybody. You can now disconnect if you would like, or if you wanted to have a continued conversation in the chat for a moment, you sure can too there. So thank you.
Thanks, Ginger.
Bye, Ginger.
Goodbye.